Well, we're in the midst of a series around the downhill slope, really, of the series on for Lent called Soundtrack for Lent, using the devotional written by J.D. Walt from Seedbed Publishing called A 40-Day Playlist Through the Psalms. Hang on. We are looking at a new psalm every day, a different psalm throughout the week, and then we land on one for Sunday. You know, the Psalms are the hymn book of the early church, and it was from the Psalms that Jesus learned to sing his faith. And it is from the Psalms that we learn to sing our faith and to pray and to worship. No wonder the monastic tradition, the tradition is to sing through all the Psalms in the course of a few weeks, all 150 of them, singing 4 or 5 Psalms every day, or more every day. So far, we've looked at Psalm 44, which we subtitled Abandoned. Psalm 59, we subtitled Angry. Last week, we looked at Psalm 4, which we subtitled Answer. And today, we're looking at Psalm 28, which we subtitle Adore. If you notice, all of those subtitles start with the letter A. So, Psalm 28, there are 4 sections to this psalm. The first one is verses 1 through 4. And it's the petitioner's prayer. In this case, it's David who is writing and petitioning. The second section is just one verse, verse 5, and that's the pronouncement of judgment. The third section is the response, verses 6 and 7. And the final section, the final declaration, verses 8 and 9. So let's jump into this. Let's look at the psalm a little more closely. This is Psalm 28, verses 1 through 4, the first section, and I'm going to read from the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. To you, O Lord, I call. My rock, do not refuse to hear me. For if you are silent to me, I shall be like those who go down to the pit. Hear the voice of my supplication as I cry to you for help, as I lift up my hands toward your most holy sanctuary. Do not drag me away with the wicked and those who are workers of evil, who speak peace with their neighbors while mischief is in their hearts. Repay them according to their work, and according to the evil of their deeds. Repay them according to the work of their hands. Render them their due reward. This is another personal lament psalm of David. It continues along the lines of Psalm 26, which you want to compare Psalm 26 and 28. You'll see some similarities. David cries out in desperation, "Do not refuse to hear me," he says. And he's addressing God directly in the second person. He cries out to God because he doesn't want to be judged along with the wicked. Instead, he wants God to repay the wicked for their wickedness, or as he says, according to the works of their hands. He calls God my rock, which is an ancient symbol of the God of Israel, perhaps stemming from the rocky Mount Sinai where the law was delivered through Moses. It conveys permanence or strength, security and stability, the rock. As I lift up my hands, says David, that's an act of worship, an act of prayer. Do not drag me away with the wicked. David knew he was a sinner. He acknowledged his sins, but he doesn't consider himself part of the wicked. He wants God to separate him from those whom he considers wicked. For if you are silent, says David to me, I shall be like those who go down to the pit. The understanding of the Israelites at the time of David is that when one dies, one goes to the pit or to the grave or a tomb where it is characterized by silence and darkness. They didn't believe at that time that souls ascended to God in heaven when they died, but rather that they waited in the grave until God would come to get them. In other words, if God were silent, it would be like, for David, that he was in the grave. Verse 5, the next section says, because they do not regard the works of the Lord or the works of his hands, he will break them down and build them up no more. David drops into referring to God in the third person. You notice he turns from addressing God directly to talking about God, almost like a commentary on his own prayer, and he pronounces judgment on the wicked as a result. And then the next section, verses 6 and 7, says this, Blessed be the Lord, for he has heard the sound of my pleadings. The Lord is my strength and my shield. In him my heart trusts. So I am helped, and my heart exalts. And with my song I give thanks to him. David's response is to worship. Another word for worship is adore, or adoration, which is our word for today. And as he contemplates the righteousness of God, God's righteous judgment, and the fact that God hears the sound of his pleadings, David's response is to worship. That's a key to the whole psalm. As we reflect on it in a few moments, we'll come back to that. And then the last section, verses 8 and 9. The Lord is the strength of his people. He is the saving refuge of his anointed. O save your people and bless your heritage. Be their shepherd and carry them forever. This final section is a declaration. David declares the truth about God, that he is the strength of his people, that the saving refuge of his anointed is God, the anointed referring to the King of Israel. And then a final plea for God to save your people and bless your heritage, be their shepherd and carry them forever. We can't help but reflect on Psalm 23, where God is referred to as my shepherd, and to the imagery of Jesus as the good shepherd. As a people who raised sheep, the imagery of sheep and shepherds was important to ancient Israel. They could relate to it very well. It's a little more difficult for those of us who were raised in the city or the suburbs. But for those who were raised around sheep, it makes a lot of sense. Sheep do what their shepherd calls them to do because they know their shepherd's voice and they trust him or her. The shepherd protects the flock from dangers and leads them to food and water. And just like a shepherd, God, who loves and takes care of us, his sheep. And if we trust him, we will have everything that we need. Like so many Psalms, Psalm 28 is a reflection of a difficult life and how a faithful person rightfully responds to those difficulties. Although in this case, it's not about enemies who are attacking David. Rather, Psalm 28 is just about the wicked and how David doesn't want to be lumped in with them as God punishes them. In Psalm 28, David reflects upon the righteousness of God, his mercy, and his justice. And as a result, David waxes into worship. This is so important. If you don't get anything out of the Psalms, get this. When life is hard and complex and stressful, and when things seem to be out of whack, a faithful person cries out to God in worship. This is what lament is. It's crying out to God. Because if we cry out to God, it shows that we have hope, because we trust in God, we believe in God. When we cry out to him and we know that he hears us by faith, the only thing we can do is worship him. There have been many times when I have been so stressed and worried and oppressed by circumstances that I just put on some worship music in my office or at home or wherever I am, and I just lay on the floor and I worship the Lord. I'll cry out to him and lift my voice to adore him out loud, even screaming, which can be a little bit disruptive in the office, but hey, it's what happens. The amazing thing is that it really helps. It really does. It helps me to lay my burdens down, to lay them at his feet. And if you've never tried that, I encourage you to do so. We're not called to fix every problem that comes our way. And we can become overwhelmed so easily and so burdened by the circumstances. But if we turn to the Lord and worship him, we'll find that burden being lifted. We'll find the difficulty of the circumstance lessened, and we'll be able to go on more easily and more faithfully. And if you don't have worship music handy, sing the Psalms. That's what we've been learning this series, singing the Psalms. Psalm 28 is a good one, and the tune we sang to it today is common enough. You can sing along to it. So it's good to have a metrical version of the Psalms also. That's what we sang, was a metrical version of the Psalm. It'll look a little different than the Psalm in your Bible. That's because it's set to a metrical meter so that it's easier to sing. This Lenten series has been so good because it's introduced to us many psalms that are very, very singable. And you can purchase a metrical version of the Psalms. The one that we've been using in this series is called a metrical psalter. The Book of Psalms Set to Meter for Singing by Julie and Timothy Tennant, which is published by Seedbed Publishing. I encourage you, that's a great one. There are other ones out there. It even makes some suggestions for you of the hymn tunes that you can use to sing each psalm. So remember, when the world gets you down, and it gets me down a lot, turn to God in worship. Turn to Him in worship. Sing the Psalms. Sing your praises to the Lord. Adore Him, and see if it doesn't change your perspective and lighten your heart. Next week, we're going to be looking at Psalm 121. The title is Soundtrack of Lent, Abide. And because of the staff retreat next weekend, as I mentioned, we will not have the 9 o'clock service next Sunday, but we will have the 10 o'clock live stream service. As the staff gathers this week, we will pre-record it and then premiere it on Facebook so that you can watch it at the usual time at 10:30 Pacific Daylight Time, as usual. But I ask you, as we enter into the weekend next weekend, to pray for the staff as we go off and spend time in prayer, in worship, in fellowship, team building, and rest and recreation in the great outdoors. We'll appreciate those prayers and thank you from the bottoms of our heart. Now let's spend a few moments in prayerful reflection as we consider the things that God may be speaking to our hearts.